gentleman is Dr. Azriel Bermant, who will tell us about Margaret Thatcher in the Middle East. About our speaker. Born and educated in Britain, Azriel Bermant is the son of that well-known journalist, Bermant, Zal, who wrote books including fiction dealing with Anglo-Jewry, and whom some of us remember as the Jewish Chronicle's Ben Azai columnist. Azriel received his PhD at University College London and is a foreign policy and international security researcher, analyst, author and lecturer. His areas of expertise include British foreign policy, Anglo-Israel relations, US policy in the Middle East, arms control and nuclear deterrence. That's just part of those. His articles, commentaries and interviews have appeared in numerous journals such as the Daily Telegraph, The Economist, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, Haaretz, the Jewish Chronicle and Time magazine. He has also worked for the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs and spoke at the Royal United Services Institute conference on missile defense 5 years ago in London. Dr. Bermant is currently a lecturer in international security at Tel Aviv University. And tonight's lecture draws its inspiration from his doctoral thesis and from his first book, Margaret Thatcher in the Middle East, published in August 2016 by Cambridge University Press. I now have much pleasure in welcoming our speaker and inviting him to deliver his address. Thank you very much.
Can anyone hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Now we can.
I'll start with that microphone and if...
No, you need it.
Okay, is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you very much for inviting me. This is a real pleasure to be here tonight. This is only my second attempt. This is only my second opportunity I've had to actually give a talk about my book here in Israel. I've given a number of talks in the UK, so this really is really delighted to be able to come here tonight. I also, I know that so many of you knew my late father's work, appreciated his work and his writing. So I'm happy to, also, of course, there's also the Scottish angle. Kenneth invited me, and of course, my father was originally from Glasgow, so there is that also the Scottish angle as well. Margaret Thatcher was said half jokingly. Jonathan Aitken, who was a Conservative MP, joked during when Margaret Thatcher basically during the early part of her career in office, he said, Margaret Thatcher knows nothing about the Middle East. She probably thinks that Sinai is the plural of sinus. Well, that might have been, actually, as it happens, right from the beginning, as an MP in Finchley, in the late 50s, when she first became an MP, straight away she actually expressed a lot of interest in Israel and the Middle East. But without a question, by the time she was several years in office, she was very much had become a stateswoman, and when it came to the Middle East, as in other foreign affairs issues, she was absolutely very much a world leader, an authority, and that included issues relating to the Arab-Israel conflict and beyond in the Middle East. Now, I recently wrote an article about the differences, or should we say the similarities, between Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May in the British magazine Standpoint. And one of the fascinating things is how similar Thatcher and Theresa May, when it comes to the Arab-Israel conflict, there are remarkable similarities between the two leaders. Maybe not on other issues, maybe not in their style of leadership, but when it comes to Israel, very paradoxical. On the one hand, both Thatcher and May very pro-Israel, very sympathetic to Israel, also to some degree being prepared even to criticise, for example, Margaret Thatcher on the PLO was very much tried to assert her own stance and push back against Foreign Office efforts to try and upgrade Britain's relationship with the PLO. Similarly, Theresa May, for example, criticised John Kerry, criticised the Obama administration over the UN resolution which they supported, which condemned Israel's settlements. The paradox is that at the same time, both Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May have also, in other ways, have been rather less supportive in other areas. For example, Thatcher fiercely condemned Israel over Israel's bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, something I'll come to soon. And she was also very, very critical of Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. Now, on Theresa May, for example, Britain supported the General Assembly resolution which condemned the Trump administration's decision to recognise, to set up an embassy in Jerusalem, for example. So now, important thing to state here is that as it will become clear during my talk this evening, there are actually very considerable differences in the political environment. When Thatcher was Prime Minister, this was, of course, when she came into office, this was the height of the Cold War. And her policy, her thinking about Russia, her thinking about the Soviet Union, dominated all areas of policy, including policy in the Middle East. Also, important to state that the Arab world was very unified against Israel. Of course, Israel had just signed a peace agreement with Egypt at the end of the 1970s, but the Arab world was very much united against Israel, whereas today the situation is rather different. You have a situation where there are parts of the Arab world, countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other Gulf states, that see Iran as a greater threat than the Arab-Israel conflict. In other words, the Arab-Israel conflict has very much fallen down the list of priorities in the Middle East. But this wasn't the case during the Thatcher period. So what I would say is that the conditions for supported policy on Israel were not so favourable during the period that Margaret Thatcher was in office. They're rather more favourable today. Okay, so what I want to important thing is one of the fascinating things, one of the fascinating quotes I came across when I very much during my early years when I first started researching this topic was Thatcher and her compromise. Because of course she saw compromise as a dirty word, and in fact, if I can quote Thatcher's book Statecraft, she says, "Throughout my political life, I've usually sought to avoid compromise because it more often than not turns out to involve an abdication of principle. In international affairs, it is often symptomatic of muddle and weakness. But over the years, I've been forced to conclude that the Arab-Israel conflict is an exception. Here, a historic compromise is indeed necessary." So it's fascinating that on this particular issue, she saw compromise as essential. The question is why on this particular issue? Yeah, the quote is up here. Now, I will argue, in fact, I've argued in my book, that Thatcher's Cold War thinking, in other words, her attitude towards the Soviet Union and the need to keep the Soviets out of the Middle East was a very important element of her policy in the Middle East. And this was very influential in her thinking. Maybe not the only issue, but certainly I would say a very, very important issue in explaining why Thatcher and her government acted as it did. Now, during another fascinating thing, you would probably have expected Thatcher to perhaps to be during the point when she was most powerful. During that point, you would probably expect her to actually push back against the Foreign Office and to pursue her own independent policy, or at least be more assertive in supporting, let's say, supporting Israel. But in fact, what actually happened is during the early period in office, in other words, in 1979, 1980, when she first came into office, this was probably when she was most assertive, or at least pushed back against the Foreign Office, and when she was more supportive of Israel. In fact, later on, when she became a more powerful Prime Minister, she was actually far closer to the thinking of the Foreign Office, namely the need to try and pursue a resolution of the Arab-Israel conflict, and also to actually look at the interests of Britain in the Arab world, and to place the interests of Britain in terms of its commercial interests, its economic ties to the Arab world as a priority over friendship with Israel, if you like. Now, in 1979, when Thatcher first came into office, she very much saw Israel as a strategic asset. Britain's Foreign Secretary in those years was Lord Carrington, Peter Carrington, who was very much an old-fashioned Arabist, who prioritised right from the get-go. He believed strongly in supporting Palestinian self-determination, strengthening Britain's relationship with the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, which of course in those days was seen as a terrorist organisation, not just by Israel, by the United States. But Carrington believed strongly that Israel had to make, that British policy needed a shift, and Britain needed to recognise Palestinian self-determination and take the lead in recognising the Palestinian state and upgrading the relationship with Yasser Arafat. Now, when he put forward a proposal to do this, Thatcher was very sceptical. Not just that, in fact, she did not like the idea. In a letter, she expressed concern that, as she put it, that the oil-producing states would fall under the direct influence of the Soviet Union. Only Israel would be the only country in the Middle East that would stand up to the Soviets, that would stand up to the communists. And Israel, Britain simply could not do anything to damage Israel as the only ally of the West in the region. So during this very early point, Thatcher clearly saw Israel as an important asset in the struggle against the Soviet Union. This situation changed over time, but definitely during her first year in power, this was very strongly her belief that Britain could not do anything which would weaken Israel. You have here Lord Carrington here in the centre during a visit to the United States. Now, one of the significant things that happened, which probably had an impact on Thatcher, was her meeting with Menachem Begin, literally days after she came into office. Now, it's important to state that Britain had for many years tried to keep Begin out of the country because of his role in violence against the British during the Mandate period. But it was actually the Callaghan government, James Callaghan and his Foreign Secretary, David Owen, who brought Begin out of the cold, so to speak, and invited him to London to try and encourage him to reach a peace agreement with Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat. And in fact, Callaghan had a fantastic relationship with Begin, so did David Owen, and Begin really appreciated the way they treated him. So Begin who used to view Britain as almost as an adversary during the Mandate period and afterwards, came to see Britain very much over time more as a friend. So when he visited Margaret Thatcher, he was already, his views towards Britain had shifted. However, his meeting with Thatcher was pretty much a disaster for a number of reasons. Probably the main reason, one of the reasons, is the fact that Begin frankly said to Thatcher that Britain should have blown up the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, which probably might not have been a smart thing to do when he's just visited Thatcher for the first time, and that really got things off to the wrong start. Thatcher said, well, actually, I'm not sure if that would have been the right thing to do, because Britain was fighting against the Germans and had to do everything they could to defeat Germany, and this would have diverted Britain. I'm not sure if I would have done that. So this rankled, and then of course there was the fact that Carrington and Begin were almost in a fight over settlements, and Begin insisted that Israel would not stop building settlements in the West Bank, and Carrington said, these settlements have to stop. So pretty much you had this lunch going on with Begin and Carrington basically getting almost into a fight. This was not a very good start. But for Thatcher, one of the important things she had to make clear right at the outset was that Begin had to do everything he could to help Anwar Sadat, because of course he just signed a peace agreement with Egypt, and she was worried about Sadat and the fact that he was taking great risks, and he needed Israel to help him. In other words, Israel needed to try and reach a settlement with the Palestinians in order to help Egypt. But for her, this was also a geopolitical issue. She says to Begin, quote unquote, what we are worried about is that the whole thing could blow up again and you would be in the centre of it. We all face the threat and the tyranny of the Soviet Union, and are concerned that the next stage be genuine consolidation of the peace process. Therefore, we ask you to bear in mind Anwar Sadat's difficulties. Now, it's interesting that she brings the Soviets in here, and I see this as the fact that she believed that Israel had to be seen to be doing something because she believed that as long as there was no peace in the region, the Soviet Union would exploit this, and there's a vacuum, and other forces would come in and into the vacuum, and this would be very damaging to the West. So you could see the way Thatcher was thinking about. You could see the slow evolution in her thinking. And in fact, in a letter from Thatcher's private secretary, he said, quote unquote, Mr. Bacon's attitude could kill the whole process of the search for a comprehensive settlement of the Middle East. This was Thatcher's fear. There's no question that Begin and Thatcher got off on the wrong foot. And there was no chemistry, or at least little chemistry, no rapport. And Begin was very disappointed because he'd gone on so well with James Callaghan, David Owen, and now suddenly Mrs. Thatcher was in power. It wasn't Thatcher, particularly Begin, of course, had just gone into office 2 years earlier, and the Likud government was certainly very, very determined to expand the settlements in the West Bank. They saw people like Lord Carrington as old-style Arabists, and sort of, for Begin, Carrington was a throwback to the Mandate period, or the old British. So this is basically the context of the time. Now, we also have to remember that the Carter administration in the United States was very much a lame duck administration, with what was going with, of course, the US embassy in Iran being occupied. Carter was simply not in a position to take any initiatives in the Arab-Israel conflict. So what ended up happening by the end of the 1970s, the early 1980s, what started happening is the EEC, the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the European Union, decided that they had to take an initiative, that the West had to be seen to be doing something to resolve the conflict, which meant if America wasn't going to do anything, then Europe had to do something. What happened at the end of 1979? A major event, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This ushered in, if you like, the end of détente, and the situation between the Soviets and the West deteriorated swiftly. This Soviet invasion was actually seen by the British as an opportunity, because they saw this as a way to get the Arab world on board. If Britain was to take a strong stance on the Arab-Israel conflict, if Britain was seen to be supporting the Palestinians, And this would help win over the Arab world to Britain, to Europe, to the West. Now, in an very interesting letter that Thatcher sent Jimmy Carter in January 1980, she said, "The Russians had continued to pursue a policy of expansion and subversion whenever they felt they could get away with it." So, in countering the Russians, Thatcher argued for the importance of selling arms to Muslim countries, to denounce Russia's invasion of Afghanistan, and she called for acceleration of negotiations to sell arms to countries such as Oman, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And interestingly, she drew Carter's attention to the view of the Saudis and other Arab countries, that the view of the Saudis was that the whole Western position in the area was undermined by the Arab-Israel conflict and the failure to solve the Palestinian problem. So here you have it, the belief that if the conflict between Israel and the Arabs was not resolved, then you had basically, this was causing a major cause of all the problems in the Middle East, and the Russians and other hostile powers would benefit and cause the West problems. And what actually happened by June 1980 is you had the EEC Venice Declaration, which is a landmark declaration by the Europeans, where for the first time they recognised Palestinian self-determination and also a role for the Palestinian Liberation Organization in peace negotiations. Of course, it was also emphasized that Israel's, all the states in the region, their security would have to be, the right to security, including, of course, Israel, was paramount. But this EEC declaration was basically ignited as firestorm in Israel. The Begin government was absolutely furious with Europe for recognising the Palestinian self-determination, and of course Yasser Arafat's PLO. And of course we shouldn't forget that the Venice Declaration also condemned Israel's settlement buildings and also emphasised there should be no state change in the status of Jerusalem. So this was really a red rag to a bull as far as Israel was concerned. I want to quote Shlomo Argov, who was at that time was Israel's ambassador in London. He said, "Britain was fed by narrow self-interest involving the supply of oil and the disgraceful surrender to the dictates of Arab oil producers." So as far as Israel was concerned, they saw this as Britain and other European countries surrendering to the oil interests of the Arabs and basically selling Israel down the river, as it were. Now, there was also Menachem Begin. He saw this almost as Europe. The Nazis had exterminated 6 million Jews, and now the Europeans were once again collaborating with the killers, in other words, the PLO, with those who wanted to destroy Israel. So he was up in arms. He was absolutely furious, and of course this led to a major crisis in the relationship between Israel and Britain. It's important to emphasise here that during the Cold War period, there was also an important thing, as I mentioned, was to rally the Arabs to the West and try and neutralise Moscow. And also, of course, we have to mention the fact that the Soviets championed, as it were, the rights of the Palestinians. So the West also felt the need to challenge the Soviets and show that they could also champion the rights of the Palestinians. This also had to be seen in the Cold War context. But this really was very damaging for ties between Israel and Britain. Important to say, though, that Thatcher was not enthusiastic about the Venice Declaration. It was Britain's, it was Lord Carrington, Douglas Hurd, who at that time was Foreign Office Minister, who were very much at the forefront of the efforts to bring about the shift in Britain's policy towards the Palestinians. Thatcher went along with it reluctantly, but the bottom line is she endorsed it. So she went along with it, but of course within the Jewish community, they threw the brickbats at Carrington, whereas Thatcher was pretty much insulated because she was seen as a friend, was seen as the friend, Israel's friend, as it were, while Carrington and Douglas Hurd, to a lesser extent, were seen as the people, the culprits for this shift in policy. Now, interesting, Begin's letter to Thatcher after the Venice Declaration, very phenomenal, unbelievable what he wrote. He said, "Madam Prime Minister, did anybody since the days of Hitler and Goebbels, Goering, Rosenberg and Stryker ever declare more plainly and more precisely that the endeavour is to destroy both our people and our state again? And yet the great free democratic countries of Europe assembled and asked us, the elected representatives of the people of Israel, the United States of America and all other nations, to recognise that organisation as a future partner in peace talks. This is not only astonishing, as I said, it hurt us deeply." So, here, you can see it here. This is a very, as you can see, very passionate letter, which the British Prime Minister did not take to. She also, of course, in the same letter, Begin put forward a request to Britain for arms, and the letter went unanswered. It did not go down well, either with Thatcher or with anyone else. You had a major crisis, you had a major problem in relations, and matters didn't get much better during 81 and 82, as I'll explain in a moment. But I should say at the same time, Thatcher was still very sympathetic to Israel's security concerns, and she was prepared to speak frankly when she was unhappy. And one good example is the issue of terrorism. She had disagreements with the Foreign Office over its attempt to try and improve relations with the PLO. And in fact, it was during the visit to Kuwait that she said, "The PLO's real objective is to drive Israel into the sea and wipe it off the face of the globe." She didn't say that to a Jewish audience, she said that when she went to Kuwait. She was prepared to speak her mind. She also refused to host a PLO official, which had formed part of an Arab League delegation in December 1982, and as a result, the visit was called off. So she was prepared to push back on occasions against policy on the PLO. And I'll make one other important point to make here. Throughout her time in office, Thatcher did not believe in the idea of a independent Palestinian state. She believed that it would not be viable. What she did believe in was the idea of what she called a confederation between Jordan and the West Bank. In other words, a solution would have to include the Jordanians, and the West Bank would be returned to the Jordanians as part of a long-term peace agreement. Now, what was also absolutely essential point is that the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis were vital allies, important moderate allies as far as Britain was concerned. And of course, Thatcher had built a very, very strong relationship, particularly with Jordan's King Hussein, and he influenced her very strongly in her policy. So I would say that King Hussein played a very important part when it came to her evolving attitude towards the Arab-Israel conflict. And she believed it was necessary to do everything possible to strengthen the moderate forces in the Middle East. When I say moderate forces, I'm talking about King Hussein in Jordan, Mubarak in Egypt, the Saudis, and also, in her eyes, Shimon Peres. Of course, Peres was during the early 80s, of course, was not in power. He was in the Labour opposition, but he would play a pivotal role from 1984 onwards. Now, interesting, one of the most fascinating things when I did my research was how Thatcher's perhaps the strongest condemnation of Israel came when Israel bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor in June 1981. Thatcher believed that there was no justification for the attack on Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor. She believed there was no evidence to show that the Iraqis were building nuclear weapons. Now, it's interesting because for example, there was some within the Jewish community who believed that Thatcher was simply taken in by the Foreign Office advisors. But in fact, she took, if anything, she took a stronger line against Israel than some Foreign Office officials. For example, Anthony Parsons, very much an Arabist, who became Britain's ambassador to the UN, actually wrote in a cable that Iraq was possibly using its membership of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a means to sinister cloaking its activities in its reactor, which could possibly be used for nefarious purposes. So Anthony Parsons had suspicions that Saddam Hussein was indeed developing weapons of mass destruction, but Thatcher seemed to believe otherwise. When Nathan Begin spoke to US Senator Charles Percy, he was, I want to quote, he said, "The children of Baghdad are not our enemies. We should tell Mr. Senator that I would never give such an order. Saddam Hussein is our enemy, not the Iraqi children. He is cruel like an animal. What we did was an act of salvation involving the Iraqi nuclear reactor." When Greville Janner, who at that time was of course the head of the British Board of Deputies of British Jews, when he asked if Thatcher was not in fact relieved that Israel had bombed the nuclear reactor, she replied, "Had there been an attack on Israel of the kind that has just been on Iraq, I would totally have condemned it. I therefore totally and utterly condemn the attack on Iraq." So, no bones about it. She really, not just that, she supported UN condemnation of Israel, and would not simply felt that Israel's bombing was an act of international anarchy, as she put it, during an interview with the JC. There was also an important issue to add here, which is that Iraq was, if you like, seen as a country, Arab country, which was, if you like, coming out of the cold and moving towards the west. So that may well have been part of the reason why Thatcher was very angry with Israel's action. Of course, we have to add the concerns that she believed this would be damaging to Jordan's King Hussein as well. But still, this is actually a fascinating episode. There was a brief period, a few months during the early period of 1982, when there were hopes of an improvement in relations, especially when Lord Carrington made the decision to visit Israel in March 1982. He really wanted to patch things up with Israel. He wanted to improve the relationship with Menachem Begin. But of course, all that fell apart when the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands, and Lord Carrington had to rush back from Israel and had to resign, decided to resign on returning to London. And of course, what ended up happening at the same time, it emerged that Israel was selling arms to the Argentinians, and of course this was the last thing he needed. This was deeply damaging for Britain's Jewish community, and also, of course, put Israel in a difficult situation. It's a very difficult period. 1982 was a very difficult period in Anglo-Israel relations, possibly even worse than in 1980. And then when Israel invaded Lebanon in June 1982, this made matters worse because, of course, Britain, having just fought the Argentinians over the Falkland Islands, framed Israel's invasion of Lebanon in a very negative light. But from Israel's point of view, Britain was simply hypocritical, because Britain was flying its troops thousands of miles away to some island in the middle of nowhere, and Israel was as Israel put it, we were responding to rockets on our territory. So they saw Britain as simply very hypocritical in their attitude towards Israel. of course, the real things reached a point, a very difficult point in September 1982 with the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And it's interesting to look at some of the views within the Jewish community itself. I want to show you this quote from Lord Mishkin, a very strong-worded letter to Menachem Begin. And of course there was an editorial in the JC calling on Begin to resign. Also, fascinating statement from the then Chief Rabbi, Manuel Zakowicz, which I'm also going to share with you here. Really very powerful statement. Now, this was really, the thing about the Lebanon War, of course, was that this came on top of everything else. The Venice Declaration was already bad enough, but the Lebanon War worsened things. And of course, you had in the background the issue of Israel selling arms to Argentina, and the fear was that these arms, these Israeli arms, General Janner had a meeting with Moshe Aarons, who was then later became Israel's defense minister, and Janner told Aarons that if, heaven forbid, Israeli arms were to be found responsible for the sinking of British ships or killing of British servicemen, this would be disastrous for British Anglo Jewry. This sort of gave you a sense of the difficulties that Anglo Jewry was in at the time, and also explains why things were so difficult between Britain and Israel. At the same time, it's important to mention Britain was also supportive of an embargo against Israeli arms. Wouldn't send British arms to Israel, and this also sort of made matters worse. It created a very difficult atmosphere, and it took a while for relations between Britain and Israel to recover. Now, things did, the recovery period, I would say that the turning point came in 1984 in the Israeli general election, which resulted in a very narrow victory for the Labour alignment against the Likud. But what ended up happening is you ended up having a national unity coalition between Shimon Peres of Labour and Yitzhak Shamir of the Likud. And it was a very, very difficult relationship. And basically we had a recipe for paralysis. Yehuda Avner, who was Israel's ambassador to London, called it a grotesque arrangement, as he put it. And it was really difficult to get anything done when you had these two people who were basically strong, so many differences, and neither trusted the other. So you had a very difficult, the period between 1984 and 1988 was really, the two of them were pretty much at loggerheads. Now, Peres became Prime Minister from basically September 1984 until the autumn of 1986, while Shamir was Israel's Foreign Minister. And then, in the autumn of 86, Shamir took over as Prime Minister, and Peres became Foreign Minister. Now, Thatcher saw Peres as a new hope to achieve peace, because of course Peres, who used to be a hawk, started coming around to the idea that Israel could no longer occupy the major Palestinian population centers in the West Bank. Israel needed to reach a territorial compromise with Jordan. So Peres was prepared to start making concessions, and not immediately, but he certainly believed that Israel had to make some kind of move towards peace. Thatcher very much supported Peres over Shamir. What ended up happening in 1985 was that Margaret Thatcher, for the first, perhaps the only time, got involved in an initiative. She invited a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation to London in the autumn of 1985. She did so very much to help King Hussein, because it was King Hussein who was trying to push Thatcher to try and play an active role in the Middle East. Of course, I should mention the US president by this point, of course, was Ronald Reagan. King Hussein felt that Reagan wasn't doing anything to bring things forward. He felt that he saw an opportunity for Thatcher to play a role and try and take an initiative. And Thatcher did so. She wanted to help King Hussein, and she also believed with Paris now, as Israel's Prime Minister, there was an opportunity. So she invited these, what ended up happening is she invited two PLO low-level officials to London. The idea was that they would renounce terrorism, recognise Israel, accept Resolution 242, and this would pave the way for negotiations between Israel and the Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. Unfortunately for that show, it all went wrong because one of the Palestinians came to London and refused to go ahead with renouncing terrorism. Why he did so is a whole separate story, which is in my book. So a little plug there for my book, what ended up happening is Thatcher ended up looking around the city. The whole peace bid fell apart. And in fact, King Hussein was actually very understanding and said, it's not your fault. He in fact blamed Yasser Arafat because, of course, Arafat was seen as the guilty party for the fact that the whole thing fell apart because of the pressure on the moderate Palestinians. Now, interestingly, by the way, Peres was very much against this initiative that Thatcher had taken. He said, because he felt he was very much, at that point, was very much against bringing the PLO in. The PLO was, as far as Peres was concerned, not just in the Likud, Peres also believed that the PLO was a terrorist organisation, and he felt this undermined Israel, and so he wasn't happy with the move, but the whole thing fell apart. But what did happen in 1986 was that the first time ever a British Prime Minister visited Israel. Thatcher became the first British Prime Minister to visit Israel while in office. And she did so because she wanted to help Peres. And it was a huge victory for her. I mean, Israelis thronged the streets. They loved her. They couldn't get enough of her. The streets were clean. Thatcher was accompanied Peres. She visited Ashkelon. She visited all sorts of Anglo-Jewish projects. A huge success. And it's important to state that part of the appeal for many Israelis, part of the reason they liked Thatcher was because, of course, she had supported Ronald Reagan in the bombing of the Libya after Libya was seen as becoming involved in terrorism. So Thatcher was seen very much as a fighter against terrorism, and they loved her. But this was very much, for Thatcher, this was very much about strengthening Peres, helping Peres and strengthening him. But of course, this wasn't really enough, because Peres needed the Americans to support him. The Americans were not prepared to get involved in Israeli politics. They didn't want to get their hands dirty. They didn't want to support one person at the expense of another. Now, in April 1987, you have an very interesting initiative. Shimon Peres and King Hussein meet in London in April 1987, a secret meeting which is designed to lead to an international conference involving Israel and Jordan and potentially a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. But this is a very exciting initiative. Thatcher hosts, basically, she played a leading part in organising this meeting between Peres and Hussein. There was just one problem. The problem, of course, was that Yitzhak Shamir was dead against it. And believe it or not, he sent his defence minister, Aarons, to the United States, to George Shultz, who was then Secretary of State. Aarons said to Shultz that Peres wanted to hurt Shamir and warned him not to get involved in this initiative. And of course, Shamir, as far as he was concerned, did not trust Peres. He felt the whole thing was going against Shamir. He took it personally. He also didn't trust Peres and what he was doing. And he didn't trust the Palestinians, didn't trust any idea of making concessions to the Palestinians. The Americans did not get involved. And as far as that, and that was pretty much the end of that. Thatcher didn't want to give in. And she spoke to US Secretary Schultz and said that this was a problematic. That basically Yitzhak Shamir, as she put it, was holding the entire world ransom, and there would never be negotiations as long as he was in power. In fact, she said, quote unquote, that Shamir's position was hypocritical because it denied basic rights to the Arabs and removed Israel's credibility as the only Middle East democracy. This is powerful stuff. But Schultz would not get involved. He said that we can't get involved in domestic Israeli politics if we try and support. He warned Thatcher. He said if you try to support Peres, he'll lose. And you need to also give thought to the other side. You need to give thought to Shamir as well. So Thatcher became very frustrated with Reagan over the Arab-Israel conflict. She even sent a letter to Reagan where she warned him that there was an urgent need to support the Paris-Christian Accord, as she put it, because this offered the best bulwark against the expansion of Soviet influence in the region, as well as the most effective way of reassuring the moderate Arab countries. But Reagan would not play ball, he was not interested. The Americans felt that you can't get involved, and this isn't going to work. So the whole Paris-Hussein Accord fell apart. You could, of course, say that there's no evidence that it would have worked anyway, but the whole thing fell apart. And what ended up happening in 1988 was that King Hussein finally disengaged from the West Bank. He basically felt that Jordan could no longer carry on, could no longer take responsibility for the Palestinians. So once King Hussein had disengaged from the West Bank, that was basically pretty much the end of Thatcher's efforts to try and bring about a peace, because she felt that everything had to go through Jordan, and once Jordan was no longer involved, this would mean going to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And Thatcher still saw the PLO as a terrorist organization. So by the end of the 1980s, you had a new situation. And before, after Reagan stepped down, you had a new administration, the Bush administration. But what ended up happening was that the PLO finally became the only address for resolving the conflict. And of course, at the end of 1988, Yasser Arafat issued a statement which seemed to imply that the PLO would recognize Israel. And once Arafat had done this, the United States was finally ready, to upgrade contacts with the PLO. And once the United States had done this, Britain was also able to do this. Thatcher was very reluctant to run ahead of the Americans. Once the Americans were ready to talk to the PLO, Britain felt that they too could strengthen or upgrade the relationship with the PLO. This basically paved the way for a closer relationship between Britain and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which of course did not go down well in Israel. But Thatcher, by the end of her time in office, simply believed, as she put it, too many Palestinians owe their allegiance to the PLO for a solution which excludes them to be durable. So she felt that there was little choice in the matter. She wasn't happy about it, but she felt that that Britain had to upgrade its relationship with the PLO. She allowed her minister, William Waldegrave, to meet with Bassam Abu Sharif at the end of 1988. This paved the way for a new relationship between Britain and the PLO. Quite simply also, towards the end of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union no longer the Cold War competition between the Soviets and Americans no longer a major issue, there appeared to be a new opportunity to resolve the conflict. Of course, time's running out now, so I'm just going to say briefly that, of course, with the end of the Cold War and the defeat of Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War of 1990, you had the Madrid Conference of October 1991. So finally, an international conference took place, something which Thatcher had tried to support and bring about. It happened after she left office. The Oslo Accords took place a short time after that. And of course, in 1994, Israel and Jordan reached a peace agreement, landmark peace agreement. But tragically, 20 years on, the hopes that were there with the peace agreement and also with the Oslo Accords have evaporated. Israel is now in a very strong position. Suddenly now we're talking about Israel having new cooperation opportunities with the Arab world, something which seemed inconceivable a few years ago. But as far as resolving the conflict with the Palestinians, that is something which is out of reach, remains out of reach. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Gentlemen in the back.
Yeah, so what you're saying, I'm also from Glasgow, so Ken's not the only one. Okay, so what you're saying that James Callaghan was more sympathetic to Israel, is that, I'm understanding you correct, than Margaret Thatcher?
Well, to put it this way, he had a much stronger related rapport with Turkey. Whether he was more sympathetic, I don't think there's much in it. Because Thatcher, in some ways, was prepared to push back on certain issues like the PLO. But Callaghan certainly built a very good relationship with David. So, from that perspective, I would say that Callaghan, in some ways, was one of the most supportive, in terms of Labour leaders, one of the most supportive leaders of the Labour Party, certainly, in competition with Blair.
Even more than Howard Wilson?
Well, Howard Wilson, you have to include him as well, but Howard Wilson during the late 60s, there were some moments when things weren't necessarily quite so warm, but generally speaking, Howard Wilson and Callaghan and Tony Blair, three Labour leaders, are very, very sympathetic.
Unlike the situation today.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Just one minor point.
Yeah.
The 1984 election was actually at a dead heat. Exactly the same number of חברי Knesset on each side.
I mean, I think Labour won, as I said, it was a very narrow victory by a couple of seats.
They didn't win. They had more than they could,
Yeah.
but the coalitions was exactly
Yeah.
the same.
Okay, yeah.
Right, lady at the back.
Just to add a little postscript to what you said about her trip in 1986.
Yeah.
She went to Sderot. The little town of Sderot was beside itself with excitement. She went with Ra Yaglon and they opened the Weetso Daycare Centre. That daycare centre, unfortunately, because of what has happened, the children are now in a rocket-proof daycare centre in Sderot, and that daycare centre is the Margaret Thatcher Centre, which is for the family, and they deal with the traumas that the family are going through, especially during periods like today.
Thank you very much. That's interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Kenneth?
Yeah, can I? Margaret Thatcher was famous for having a large number of Jewish cabinet ministers. Is there any evidence that any of them played any part in helping her formulate her Middle East policy?
Not really, no. I think I think the only minister who comes to mind in terms of the Jewish cabinet ministers who played a role in foreign policy, Malcolm Rifkin, but he didn't really deal with the Middle East so much. He dealt more with other issues. You think of all although now you mention it, there is Lord Young, although he was in trade and industry, he did at one point try and talk Thatcher out of meeting with the PLO, these PLO officials. I mean, she wasn't going to be meeting with them, it was going to be Geoffrey Howe, as Foreign Secretary, was going to meet with them. And he warned, Lord Young warned Thatcher and said, this is very bad for you to do this. And Britain, with its policy against, for example, not talking to the IRA, this wouldn't go down very well. but she didn't. I mean, she listened, but she didn't really take it on board. But there isn't really, in terms of the Jewish cabinet ministers, I didn't see them play so much of an impact on Israel. Although, of course, we have to mention there was Wolfson, David Wolfson, not a minister, but he was her chief of staff, so to speak, and he was involved to a certain degree, but not people such as the Old Britain, for example, and Keith Joseph. These people, they didn't really play a role in policy in Israel so much.
I'd like to make a comment or ask a question at the same time. The relationship between Margaret Thatcher and the Jewish community. Now, we all know the famous attribution, and she said, first of all, she thought that the Anglican hierarchy were a load of wets. And it would have been very nice if Emmanuel Jacobowitz was eligible to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm not sure how much truth there is in that, although it was said at the time. But did her relationship with the Jews in her constituency have any bearing on the way she regarded policy outside the United Kingdom?
Yes, I think that you could see quite early on in her speeches and the communication that she gave a lot of regard to her constituents, and of course there were some who believed that Thatcher's policy towards Arab-Israel conflict was influenced to a large degree by the Jewish community and by her constituency. But I think over time, it seems to me the longer she was in office, the more she sort of was able to, took it into account. But I don't think, I think when there was things, for example, the PLO, the issue of terrorism, I think she was very mindful of the hostility within the Jewish community, the anger about talking to the PLO, and I think that was something that she was influenced by. There is evidence to suggest that she was influenced by the sentiments within her constituency. Interestingly, and I write about this in my book, there was one point during the Lebanon War when Israel, there were a lot of efforts made, both from the embassy and also within the Jewish community, to try and explain to Thatcher that the Foreign Office had got it wrong over Lebanon, and that there was a lot of things that were being said about what Israel was doing that were wrong. And it appears to be, there was a point at which Thatcher allegedly tried to restrain criticism of Israel that was coming in from the Foreign Office. Certainly, if one is to believe the cables of Israel's government, it appears that she might have called on officials to restrain themselves and sort of lower the tone. So there was some influence, but I would say that perhaps the most influential of all were people such as King Hussein of Jordan and Peres in Israel, Mubarak in Egypt.
Would you say there's been any lasting influence from Margaret Thatcher on British politics or the Conservative Party?
Well,
She didn't go out in a particularly pleasant way as far as I remember.
no, I mean, I think that there are obviously, perhaps one area where you see it is, for example, on Europe, the Euroscepticism, which Thatcher exhibited particularly during the end of her time in office, which led to Brexit. So I think from that perspective, she was very influential. On the Middle East, less so. But I think simply she didn't have Britain. Important to state that Britain by the 1980s was very much a diminished power and simply didn't have the influence. And Thatcher wanted Britain to be a leader on the world stage, but simply didn't have the means to influence things. It would have been very different if Reagan had agreed with Thatcher. But in fact, Thatcher and Reagan, while they agreed on many things, when it came to the Middle East, there were a lot of disagreements. Possibly one of the strongest areas where the disagreements came out was the Middle East. This definitely had an impact.
Any more?
Just brief comment. I believe sometime during her reign, the press used to say that she was the only man in the cabinet.
She's the only man in the cabinet.
Yeah, well, that's right. No, she didn't. She spoke her mind, and she was very felt strongly about something. There were not many people who could stand in the way.
Right, any more? If not, I will ask Dr. Kenneth Collins, our Secretary, to propose a vote of thanks.
The story that's unfolded this evening is one of really great complexity because politics twists and turns at every juncture, and it's been fascinating to see what was the norm 1 year isn't not necessarily what happens the next year. Margaret Thatcher did not have a good press in Scotland, as you probably know. At one time, people said that even if Margaret Thatcher had gone round every household in the country and given each householder £1 million, people would have said there's obviously something wrong somewhere. The level of trust, and you can see that the ebb and flow of politics is something that it's very hard to give definite conclusions about one thing and the other. And you've steered us through this great complexity with considerable skill. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody for taking the trouble to come to Jerusalem and to tell us this story. And maybe that we need to examine your book in greater detail to get all the nuances of things. But for what you presented us tonight, thank you very much.